Picture the average story about the future we're trained to expect. The city is fractured, the government's corrupt, corporations are omnipotent, the climate is ruined, community is gone or reduced to a tiny pocket of resistance. The protagonist is damaged, isolated, distrustful, and forced to survive inside a world that has already given up on ordinary dignity. Even when the ending offers a glimmer of resistance, the imaginative baseline is collapse, control, scarcity, and loss. We know this story. Many of us love this story. Some of the greatest works of speculative fiction, climate fiction, horror, and dystopia operate in this mode. This isn't an argument against dark futures, but it's worth asking why they come to us so much more easily than hopeful ones do. Welcome to Demand Utopia, a Solarpunk podcast from Solarpunk Magazine. I'm your host, Justine Norton-Kertson, and a quick note before we get started, don't forget to check out our website, solarpunkmagazine.com, where you can get magazine issues, including our latest, issue number 27, which drops tomorrow on May 12th. You can read our blog, learn more about how to submit your own writing or art to the magazine. You can listen to podcast episodes there and a lot more. You can also join us over on Patreon, where you can choose from multiple subscription tiers for the magazine and access various levels of bonus content, including from this podcast. Okay, so why are hopeful stories still so hard to write? Why does it often feel easier to imagine the end of the world than the repair of it? Why do stories about breakdowns seem automatically dramatic, while stories about survival with dignity, collective problem solving, or the construction of a better society are so often dismissed as naive, didactic, soft, or dramatically thin? Why do so many writers who want to create hopeful fiction still feel themselves pulled towards sabotage, toward inserting more ruin, more betrayal, more cynicism, just to make the story work? Well, let's look at these questions. The difficulty here is not just a craft problem, though it is one, and it's not just a market problem either, though it is that too. I want to talk about this as a cultural training problem, a problem of narrative inheritance, a question about what we think counts as realism, what we think counts as seriousness, and what kinds of human behavior we've been taught to recognize as dramatically meaningful. Because, face it, hopeful stories aren't easy, but they're not hard for the reasons people usually assume. A common explanation is that hope is boring, that conflict drives narrative, and hopeful worlds have less conflict. Therefore, hopeful stories are harder to sustain. But I think that diagnosis is too shallow. Hope isn't boring. Cooperation's not boring. Neither is repair or collective decision-making. The building of trust under pressure, that's not boring. What's difficult is that many of us have been trained to recognize certain things as engines of narrative intensity. We've been trained to spot rupture more quickly than repair. Think about how many stories teach us to read drama. Betrayal is dramatic, violence is dramatic, scarcity is dramatic, oppression and corruption are dramatic. These things generate immediate stakes because they threaten bodies, values, communities, or survival. The danger is obvious, the antagonism is clearly legible, and the pressure is immediate. Now let's think about a story centered on building a tenant union in a climate-resilient cooperative neighborhood, or a story about redesigning a public water system after drought, a story about a family negotiating intergenerational care inside a solarpunk community trying to avoid reproducing old hierarchies. Those stories absolutely contain stakes and tension, but the stakes function differently. They're not always about whether something will explode or whether someone will get shot or beat up or whether relationships will dissolve in fire, right? They're often about whether people can become more capable of living together without domination. That's different stakes, not lower stakes. And the distinction's important because one reason hopeful stories are hard to write is that many writers inherit a narrow sense of what tension looks like. We know how to write against catastrophe, against tyranny. We know how to write against monsters and killers, against systems that are nakedly cruel. But do we know how to write toward a difficult good? Do we know how to sustain narrative energy around questions of care, interdependence, governance, maintenance, trust, and transformation? Often, not yet. A lot of hopeful stories fail not because hope is weak, but because the writer quietly abandons tension the moment they abandon cynicism. They remove the wrong things. They think, oh, if I'm writing a better world, then maybe people are kinder, systems are more just, and problems are less severe. And that becomes accidentally, there's nothing here to push against. But better systems don't eliminate conflict. They just change its shape. A hopeful story still needs friction. It still needs uncertainty, pressure. It needs desire colliding with limits. The difference is that the pressure may not come from total social collapse. It might come from partial success, from competing goods, from imperfect people trying to uphold better values under strain. It might come from communities disagreeing about how to allocate resources fairly, or from institutions that are more humane than ours, but still incomplete and imperfect. It might come from tension between personal desire and collective obligation, or from repair that's possible, but difficult. That's one of the craft keys, I think. Hopeful fiction doesn't eliminate conflict. Rather, it relocates it. In dystopia, conflict often emerges from domination. In hopeful fiction, conflict usually emerges from complexity. And complexity is dramatically rich. Take a simple example. In a dystopian housing story, the antagonism might be straightforward. A corporation is evicting residents from an apartment block to build luxury eco-condos. Easy stakes, easy villain, clear outrage. And that can be effective. But in a more hopeful, solarpunk-oriented story, maybe the community already has partial control over the land. Maybe they've won real gains already, and the conflict is now about how to adapt the housing for worsening floods. Some residents want to retreat, others want to stay. Some need greater accessibility, others want more communal space. Some might fear that any design will erode privacy. Others might suspect that the planning process still privileges the most articulate and well-resourced voices. Nobody's twirling a mustache. No one's purely evil, but the stakes are still enormous, both at the sort of social macro scale and at the personal scale, because the question is whether a community can remain just while changing under pressure. And that's a story. In fact, it may be more difficult and more interesting of a story than the simple eviction narrative because it requires the writer to understand multiple values at once. It demands moral complexity without collapsing into cynicism. It doesn't ask, can we destroy the villain, but can we become the kinds of people who live through this together? And now on to another reason why hopeful stories are hard to write. That reason is that we're suspicious of goodness. Or maybe not goodness exactly, but we're suspicious of overt moral aspiration. We've been trained to read sincerity as sentimental, idealism as shallow, hope as unserious, unless it's been bloodied enough to earn its place. Writers often worry that if they make people too decent, too cooperative, too committed to shared values, the story will lose its edge. Characters will feel flat, and the world will feel fake. And sometimes that fear is justified. A cast of perfectly enlightened people is boring. A community with no contradiction is lifeless. A future where everyone has already solved themselves isn't utopian. It's dead. But hopeful fiction doesn't require moral perfection. It requires moral orientation. And that's a crucial distinction. A hopeful story can include selfishness, fear, grief, pettiness, jealousy, exhaustion, right? Denial, possessiveness, error. Of course it can. The question isn't whether people remain flawed. The question's whether the story believes people and institutions are capable of moving, of changing, however incompletely, toward care, toward accountability and shared life. Hopeful fiction isn't fiction where no one fails. It's fiction where failure isn't the only truth. Another craft problem is that writers often confuse hope with certainty. If the ending is hopeful, they think the process has to feel safe. If the world is better, they think the reader must never doubt the outcome. But hope is not certainty. Hope's a mode of movement under uncertainty. It's what makes narrative possible. It's not what kills it. A hopeful story can contain danger, grief, grief's aftershocks, reversals, serious loss, even tragedy. What makes it hopeful isn't that nothing hurts. It's that pain doesn't become the world's final epistemology. This matters especially in solarpunk and adjacent futures because writers are often trying to resist the gravitational pull of apocalypse. But resisting apocalypse doesn't mean writing propaganda. It doesn't mean flattening complexity or pretending all problems have solutions that arrive neatly or easily. What it does mean is refusing the claim that cruelty is more realistic than cooperation, or that breakdown is more narratable than repair. And I do think realism is part of the problem here. We've absorbed a cultural script in which bleakness looks mature, cynicism looks observant, broken systems feel believable, where human beings disappointing each other feels plausible. But when people help one another at scale, when they build institutions that partially work, and when they choose enough over endless growth, and when they refuse domination without becoming saints, readers and even writers can recoil. Oh, that's unrealistic, they say, right? But unrealistic according to what? According to the world as it is now? According to the stories we've consumed all our lives? According to the capitalist market that's trained us to confuse familiarity with truth? There's a difference between implausible writing and unaccustomed imagination. Hopeful fiction fails when it ignores reality, but it also fails when it mistakes the present order for the horizon of the possible. A solarpunk story doesn't have to pretend that institutions are easy to build, or that people naturally cooperate without friction, because it can insist that history isn't over, that social forms aren't fixed, and that people can learn different habits of relation. And at the sentence and scene levels, that means writers need better tools. One tool is to create maintenance as drama, not just an emergency or collapse. Maintenance itself, the keeping going of things, the care of systems that matter. A story about maintaining a community garden through drought can be dramatically alive if the garden's tied to food security, memory, intergenerational knowledge, and things like neighborhood belonging. A story about upgrading a transit line for accessibility can be dramatically alive if it reveals whose needs are prioritized and what kind of public future the city is actually choosing. Another tool is to build stories around competing goods rather than simple oppositions. Privacy versus community, speed versus deliberation, local autonomy versus wider coordination, preservation versus adaptation, individual attachment versus collective need. These aren't weak conflicts. They're conflicts of adulthood, politics, and civic life. Another tool, let institutions themselves be characters. One reason dystopia is easy is that broken institutions generate immediate friction. But functioning or partially functioning institutions can also generate narrative energy if you let them matter. A resident council or a mutual aid network, a watershed board, a school cooperative, a restorative justice process. These can all be sites of incredible drama because they're places where values become procedure. They can succeed imperfectly, they can fail in revealing ways, they can be captured, reformed, defended, sabotaged, and loved. And another tool, let hope cost something. Hopeful stories become thin when hope is free, when everyone arrives at wisdom too quickly, or when repair requires no sacrifice, no discomfort, no learning or relinquishment, no risk. If your story wants hope, it has to earn it through changed behavior, not just changed mood. The world gets better because people make different choices and build different structures, often under pressure, and sometimes in conflict with their own habits. This is why I think some of the best hopeful stories aren't actually calm. They're strenuous. They're full of work, emotional work, political work, relational work, infrastructural work. What they refuse isn't difficulty, but nihilism. And you know what? Writers need permission to understand that difficulty doesn't belong exclusively to darkness. Part of what Demand Utopia can do, I hope, is help expand the repertoire of what counts as a story engine. If writers keep reaching for dystopia, sometimes it's because dystopia offers ready-made propulsion. The world is bad, the state is cruel, the corporation is evil, the clock is ticking. Great, you have a plot. Hopeful fiction requires more invention, because it asks what tensions arise in a world worth preserving, what forms of antagonism remain in a society trying to become more just. What does narrative propulsion look like when the protagonist isn't trying to escape community, but to become capable of it? That last question feels central to me. A lot of dominant storytelling is built around heroic individuation. The lone dissenter, the chosen one, the rebel who sees clearly while everyone else is compromised or asleep. There's power in that model, and it's not going away. But hopeful stories often need different arcs. Not just the arc of separation, but the arc of integration. Not just self-assertion, but mutuality. Not just exposing a rotten system, but learning how to inhabit, defend, and transform a better one. And that's hard to write because our culture worships rupture and undervalues stewardship. But stewardship has a plot. Stewardship has stakes. It has enemies, mistakes, fatigue, conflict, and transformation. The writer's task isn't to manufacture artificial darkness in order to make hope feel serious. It's to learn how to recognize the drama already present in things like repair, responsibility, and collective life. So, what should we as writers do to actually make hopeful stories easier to write? Well, first, stop asking whether your hopeful story has conflict. It does. It does. Ask what kind of conflict it has. Second, make systems visible. If the world is better, show us how. Let the story's institutions, infrastructures, and norms generate pressure and possibility. Third, resist perfect people. Give us characters with habits shaped by the old world, trying imperfectly to live into the new one. Fourth, let the stakes be relational, civic, and material, not just catastrophic. Losing trust, losing tenure, losing legitimacy, losing the chance to remain, losing a fragile commons. These are enormous stakes, stakes that matter to people. Fifth, remember that a hopeful ending doesn't require an easy middle. It requires a middle in which despair isn't the only intelligence available. And, maybe most importantly, don't apologize for wanting more fiction than diagnosis. We have no shortage of stories that can describe the wound. What we need more of are stories that can narrate the difficult, compromised, unfinished work of living through it, of living past it. That isn't naive. It may be one of the hardest imaginative tasks there is. Hopeful stories are hard to write because they ask us to imagine not only what's broken, but what could be built. Not just what is stolen, but what could be shared. Not only what domination feels like, but what responsibility might feel like. Hopeful stories ask us to take collective life seriously as a site of drama. They ask us to believe that justice has texture, that repair has tension, that institutions can be narratively alive, and that better worlds aren't static, but difficult and dynamic. In other words, they ask us to get better at writing the future we keep saying we want. And that's worth doing, because if Solarpunk and other hopeful forms are going to matter, if they're going to persist, not just as aesthetics, not just as moods or as counter-branding to apocalypse, they have to become stronger on the page, more structurally confident, more emotionally complex, more willing to dwell in contradiction without abandoning aspiration. The question isn't whether hopeful stories can be dramatic. The question is whether we're willing to retrain our narrative instincts enough to let them be. Thanks for listening to Demand Utopia. If this episode resonated with you, share it with a writer, a teacher, an editor, or a reader who cares about the future of speculative fiction. And if you want more, if you want to support the work we're doing, the magazine, the podcast, you'll find links in the episode description to our website, Patreon, and our social media. I hope you have a wonderful day. And remember, the future doesn't only need to be imagined, it needs to be narrated.